Hi, I'm Hannah from Crusty Cravings by Hannah. I'm a sourdough microbaker based in Fort Myers, Florida. I have been making sourdough for over 3 years and I've been selling it for a year to my local community. I don't know about you, but when I first started baking in bulk, it was like relearning how to make sourdough. I thought I had it down, and once I started making 4, 6, 10, 12, 14, 16 loaves at a time, things started to change very quickly and I became very inconsistent. Bulk dough behaves very differently than just a single batch of sourdough, and that is when I found the sourdough journey. Tom at the sourdough journey advocates to take the temperature of your dough, and based off of the dough's temperature, you have a general timeline of how long it will take your dough to bulk ferment. Based off of the dough temperature, you have to target a different percentage rise because not every dough temperature needs to double in size. The rate at which your dough ferments is much faster when you're dealing with a warmer dough and much slower when you are dealing with a colder dough. However, even though I was temping my dough and I was tracking my percentage rise, I was wildly inconsistent in my bulk proofing tubs. Sometimes it's hard to really visualize the percentage rise that you're targeting in a tub that is more of a rectangle or a massive bin. It doesn't have the same characteristics when it is done bulk fermenting. You don't see it dome as much in the center. In a bowl, you can see your dough has domed, that it has nice bubbles, that it's pulling from the sides, that it is jiggly, pillowy, and less sticky to the touch. But in one of these tubs, it is sometimes harder to notate the volume in which your dough has increased from the original math. That's when I found Audrey, the artisan sourdough baker, on TikTok. She's been making sourdough for nearly a decade and been a sourdough microbaker for the majority of that time. She shares a ton of scientific information and helpful tips and tricks on her TikTok if you haven't already checked that out. And she uses something called the Aliquot Method to track bulk fermentation. This is when you take a small sample size of your dough and put it in a small vessel and keep that with your mass tub of dough that is bulk fermenting to better track and visualize the percentage rise of that mass bulk dough. But some of those vessels can be really tricky to use and inconsistent. So Audrey developed the 2-ounce sample cup method, which is where you take a small condiment cup and fill it with a sample size of dough based off of the dough temperature. And when your dough completely fills the cup based off of the sample size, that's when you know you've reached your target percentage rise. However, Audrey works with 80 Fahrenheit dough, and her method works really well when you are taking 40 grams of dough and putting it in the sample cup 1 hour after all ingredients have been combined. It doesn't matter if you do a fermentalise or an autolyse. Once your salt has been added and your dough has been resting for 1 hour, that's when you take your sample size, that's when you take the dough temperature, and then you proceed with your stretch and folds like normal. You put it inside the dough so that it holds the same temperature. This is vital and very important to the success of this method. If you're not keeping the dough together, this could have a different temperature and ferment at a different rate as the mass dough. So you need to keep them together. What I was noticing with Audrey's method is that she sticks with 80 Fahrenheit dough. She always takes 40 grams of dough and puts it in her 2-ounce sample cup, and once it has reached the top of the lid, she knows her bulk fermentation is complete. But what happens for people who have a cooler dough temperature? What sample size should you put in the 2-ounce cup to target different percentage rises? I teamed up with Tom at the Sourdough Journey to create 2 charts that people could use based off of different dough temperatures and different percentage rise targets. I took his dough temperatures and the percentage rise to target for each dough temperature and created a sample size that you should put in your 2-ounce or 4-ounce cup based off of the target rise you're looking for within bulk fermentation. Tom was so gracious to allow me to include these numbers in my chart as long as I indicated that this was copyrighted material. We are not allowed to reproduce this material or put it into a chart without properly crediting him that it is copyrighted. I have seen this chart floating around, just rebranded, and it is vital that we are giving Tom and Audrey the credit that they deserve. A couple FAQs with this method. Can you use this particular method with inclusions? And if so, how? I add my inclusions during my third set of stretch and folds. Most of my bulk fermentation has been complete at that point. I like to keep my ingredients as close to room temperature as possible so it does not disturb the bulk fermentation or increase or decrease the dough temperature of the mass dough. I do not put inclusion in my sample cup, but I do try to keep the dough temperature as consistent as possible. I know that if I'm adding cold cheeses or if I'm adding cold vegetables or spices, that it could alter the dough temperature and change bulk fermentation just slightly. So this is when it's important to use intuition and adjust timing and bulk fermentation in accordance with changing those variables. What you're looking for is to keep a very consistent dough temperature throughout bulk fermentation. Take your dough temperature 1 hour after all ingredients have been combined and target your percentage rise based off of that number. However, if your dough is fluctuating, say it is increasing by the hour or it's decreasing by the hour, you may want to average out your dough temperature throughout bulk fermentation, temp several times, and then use intuition to either cut off bulk fermentation a little bit earlier or a little bit later, depending on if it is warmed up or cooled off. Your inclusions can definitely impact dough temperature, so you just have to keep that in mind and adjust accordingly. Another FAQ I get is, can you use this with enriched doughs? And unfortunately, the dough temping method and the Aliquot method doesn't work as well with enriched doughs because fermentation changes greatly when you are dealing with a dough that has added fats in it. So you wouldn't want to necessarily cut off fermentation as early as you would with an artisan loaf or a high hydration loaf. Many times you want to push proofing with lower hydration doughs or with enriched doughs a little bit further than you normally would. So I would never use the Aliquot method with a sandwich bread that has added egg, milk, and butter. I wouldn't use this for bagels. I wouldn't use this for English muffins or cinnamon rolls. It completely changes if you're dealing with an enriched dough. Something else that people don't know is that this assumes a tartine recipe where you are cold proofing for a long period of time, that you are using about 20% starter, which could be 100 grams for every 500 grams of flour, and that you are cutting it off at a certain percentage rise and letting the dough do the rest of the rise or the second rise in the proofing basket or banneton in the refrigerator. You can also use this method if you leave your dough out on the counter for the second rise, but timing will be a little bit off and you will have to use more intuition if you are doing a room temperature proofing versus the fridge. If you are doing a fridge proofing, it needs to be 10 plus hours that you're keeping this dough in the refrigerator. It can take up to 10 hours for your dough to cool and finish proofing in the fridge. So just keep that in mind. When your dough has completely filled the cup of your 2 ounce or 4 ounce sample cup, that's when you go ahead and dump it out and start your pre-shaping. Another FAQ I get is, do you just throw your sample cup away? No, I use the dough in the sample cup. I just add it to the mass dough, dump it out, cut it up into the different loaf sizes that I'm dealing with, go ahead and pre-shape, bench rest for 15 minutes, final shape, put in the banneton, stitch if I want to, and then put it in the fridge for a cold retard or a cold proofing. The next day typically is when I would go ahead and bake them. No method is going to be 100% fail-proof. Unfortunately, sometimes there are other variables to consider, like the amount of starter in your recipe, if your starter is healthy, if the dough temperature is changing, plus or minus, if you are seeing inconsistencies with the recipe that you're using or the flour type that you're using, things of that nature, you can just see different levels of activity with certain variables. And sometimes the Aliquot method fails because you are either doing it wrong or there is another variable at play that you have to consider. I have been wildly consistent since using the Aliquot method, and I personally would never go back because it has helped me tremendously. It also helps you identify what your dough is supposed to feel like when it has been bulk fermented properly. I think some people have never truly felt dough that is so pillowy, fluffy, and perfectly fermented that they don't know what to expect or what the expectation should be. And with the Aliquot method, it helps you get more consistent by just understanding what your dough should look and feel and behave like. And eventually you'll start learning your dough to where you don't even need the Aliquot method. So I hope this was helpful. On my social pages, you can find the Aliquot method instructions and the 2 charts that I made with Tom. And of course, check out Audrey's page on TikTok. She also has an Instagram and she has a website, so feel free to check those things out. I hope this method blesses you as much as it blessed me. It gave me hope, it gave me confidence, and it gave me the courage to keep going when I felt like I was having fail after fail. It helped me make consistently delicious and perfectly fermented bread, and I hope it does the same for you. Since the original video was filmed and released at the Breadwinner Summit, there have been a lot of questions and additional thoughts that have come up since then that I wanted to add to this video. The first being, what does aliquot even mean? It is a French word that means a portion of the larger whole, and this is often used in chemistry and has been a word or term that has been used for a long time in the science world. It just means taking a small sample and evaluating that to basically evaluate that larger portion that you're experimenting with, whether that is a liquid, a concoction, a tincture, or even in the sourdough world, taking a smaller portion of your dough and evaluating that to understand what that larger mass is doing. 2, where did the Aliquot method originate? The Aliquot method was popularized by Kristen from Foolproof Baking back in 2018 when she started sharing on YouTube and her Instagram about her experiments and how she was taking a smaller portion of her dough, putting it in a glass jar, which she was calling her Aliquot jar or her indicator jar. And lots of sourdough bakers were taking that and running with it. She didn't have a framework per se clearly outlined or percentage rises clearly outlined that she was trying to target based off of her dough temperature, but she was the first person to really popularize this method. In general, people understood that not all dough needs to double in size during bulk fermentation, and that temperature played a vital role in how quickly your dough would ferment and how much of a rise you should target. But there were just general guidance and not a lot of specifics or experiments done. It wasn't until 2020 that Tom from the Sourdough Journey started jumping into the world of sourdough and just lived and breathed sourdough and was doing experiments right and left and really calculating what kind of percentage rise you should target when your dough is different temperatures. That is when he created his Dough Temping method framework and released it to the public for free. It's on his website, and his charts are really easy to access and look for. Although the Aliquot method didn't specifically come from Audrey, the artisan sourdough baker on TikTok, she popularized the 2-ounce cup method and was calling it the Aliquot method, which really outlined a framework for keeping your dough at a consistent temperature, keeping it at 80 degrees, and targeting a 30% rise by taking 40 grams of your dough, putting it in a 2-ounce cup, and when it hits the lid, that indicates a 30% rise. The issue that I was seeing is that there weren't a lot of calculations done outside of just that standard 80 degree Fahrenheit dough, and not all bakers are working in an environment where their dough is going to be 80 degrees, and so you have to figure out what kind of percentage rise to target based off of lower dough temperatures. And that is when I worked with Tom from the sourdough journey to really pull his data, his charts, his research, and create sample sizes that would be correct for other bakers to use that were dealing with lower dough temperatures. That is the work that I did. I put it into a chart, approved it with Tom, and of course gave full credit to Audrey for all of her contributions. But unfortunately, I had no idea that Kristen from Foolproof Baking was the one who originally created the Aliquot method and popularized it. I had never heard of her way of doing it, and I just want to create a little bit more awareness around that there's so many people that have contributed to this work and put in their thoughts, their expertise, their experiments, their research, and their knowledge, and that there are a lot of people here that should be credited, and you should absolutely look into all of their profiles and all of their research. Does this method work for everyone? Unfortunately, the simple answer is no. We are all working in different environments with different starter percentages, different recipes, different flours. Our starters all behave very differently. And although the dough temping method has been very helpful for many bakers and has worked, there are certain environments where it wouldn't be as successful. I found out that Tom and myself are both baking at sea level, and his research and experiments and his dough temping method works for my environment, and it even works with a lower starter percentage and has been very conclusive. However, I know a lot of my friends that are baking at higher altitudes and in elevation, and unfortunately the dough temping method with his percentages do not work. It would have to be adjusted for higher altitudes and higher elevation. As you know, the environment that you work in really impacts bulk fermentation, your starter's health, how quickly things happen or how slowly they happen. And with higher elevation in general, it is said that your dough is going to ferment a lot faster than people who are baking at sea level, for example. Humidity also plays a significant role, and I work in a very humid environment, and I know that's not going to be the same for somebody working in the north. And so although the Aliquot method is a great tool and a way for you to better visualize percentage rise, you also have to feel your dough and use a lot of intuition throughout the process. Even Tom brought up a really good point at the summit and in some of his research and the things that he has posted on his website about the Aliquot method, where the dough sample could cool off a lot faster and come down to room temperature a lot faster than the mass of dough, and the mass of dough produces its own heat. And so if your little sample is not producing the same amount of heat as your mass dough, unfortunately the two could ferment at different rates, and that is why in general you can use the Aliquot cup, but you also have to know what's happening with your dough. I have had the Aliquot method fail, unfortunately, with lower dough temperatures and lower sample sizes, and I think that is mainly due to the sample size not being as accurate as the mass amount of dough fermenting. I think that the mass amount of dough, even if it started at a lower temperature, it warmed up and came to room temperature a lot faster than, say, my little dough sample, and that dough sample was not fermenting at the same rate as the mass dough. That doesn't happen with higher dough temperatures like 80 Fahrenheit dough, but it does happen with cooler dough temperatures every now and then, so you do have to be careful. The way that I would try to counteract that would be to use a bigger sample size and a bigger cup size. So if you are dealing with, say, 65 Fahrenheit dough or 70 Fahrenheit dough, I would use a 4-ounce cup and take a bigger sample size. If you are dealing with that little 2-ounce cup and you're only putting 28 grams in the cup, again, I do not think it mirrors the mass dough as well as, say, a bigger sample size. I've also had a lot of people comment and say that their dough is still sticky even with doing the Aliquot method, and they want to know what they're doing wrong. Stickiness, like I've mentioned a lot in my other videos and on my Instagram and different content that I've posted, stickiness is not the only indication that your dough is or is not properly fermented. Stickiness can also be an indication that your dough is potentially overhydrated for the flour that you're using, or two, that you are not properly developing your gluten during bulk fermentation, whether that be not doing enough stretch and folds or doing them correctly, not doing enough strengthening during the initial mix. Potentially you're not hand mixing for long enough, or you're not maybe laminating your dough to strengthen it. Maybe you're using a type of flour that has low gluten and is weaker in general and is harder to build gluten. So I would not blame your stickiness solely on not doing the Aliquot method correctly. It could be an error that you are not properly doing the method, but it also could be a lack of gluten development, again, and just not mixing well enough or not doing enough stretch and folds or strengthening techniques. So that is something to consider if you are finding that when you go to shape, your dough is still sticky. If you are doing all of those things correctly, if your starter is super healthy and you're using it at peak and your hydration is correct for the flour that you're using, it could just be that there needs to be a few things adjusted in your environment, and perhaps it is not working because of the type of environment you're working in. Again, I bake at sea level, Tom bakes at sea level, and if you're in higher altitudes, or if you just have a starter that is extremely healthy and rigorous and is fermenting your dough really fast, then you might want to adjust. And it could just be that you need to target a lower percentage rise, etc., and you have to adjust for your environment. So I think that's where becoming an intuitive baker comes in handy. All of these tools, processes, things that we use, they're really helpful. But once you get it down and you start to become more of an intuitive baker, I think the game changes, absolutely. So I hope all of these extra insights help and provide a little bit more context as to what it is, who created it, who popularized it, and ultimately what we can take from it and how we can use it in our baking to better help us with bulk fermentation. I know that there have been so many bakers who have reached out to me and said that this completely changed the game for them. They don't have to babysit their dough. They're not watching the clock. They aren't checking their dough every 5 minutes. They have peace of mind just knowing that their little Aliquot cup, as soon as it hits the lid, indicates that they should start shaping. So I hope this changes the game for you. That's why I share it. I truly want people to buy really great bread, and I want bakers who are selling their product to make incredible bread and not be selling gummy, under-fermented, dense, and nasty bread. So that's my goal, is to get you making good bread, and that's why I do what I do. That's why I share all of the tips and tricks. And I hope this helps. If you have any other questions about the Aliquot method, Tom answers questions, Audrey answers questions. I know the Pantry Mama has talked about this method, and a few other bakers use different vessels, like a little glass container with milliliters on the side. And I've seen people use glass 4-ounce cups, glass 2-ounce cups, 2-ounce Jello shot cups, you name it. There's so many people doing this method in different ways, but again, it is just to help you with better visualizing percentage rise and being more accurate and having better bulk fermentation. If you like this content, please like and subscribe and follow me on my other socials on TikTok and Instagram, and let's get you making good bread.